Welcome back to
Ami's house.
Today we are joined by a very, very special guest, CEO of the Babylon Bee.
That's right.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Ami's house, Seth Dillon. Thank you for being here, Seth.
Yeah, thanks for having me, guys.
Thanks, Seth. One of my favorite pieces of satire, not just from the Babylon Bee, but ever, was a couple months ago. You guys posted, it was an image of Bill Cosby with a Hamas headband, and it said, Bill Cosby joins Hamas to get feminists to stop condemning him for rape. So good.
We've used Cosby a few times for jokes like that. we did one about how Planned Parenthood defended Bill Cosby, saying that sexual assault was only 3% of what he did.
Amazing.
So we have a lot we want to talk to you about. We just thought we'd get started off, using that joke as an example. Where do you guys get it right where so many conservatives get it wrong in comedy?
Oh man. Well,
or how do you do it?
A lot of it has to do with the approach. We're not trying to do. We're Christian conservatives who write satire, and I think the point is that it's not. You don't want to think of it necessarily as conservative satire, but as conservatives writing satire. And I think there's a distinction between the two. We're not just trying to get our own audience riled up. We're trying to be funny. And we're trying to be insightful and thought-provoking. And so when that's the goal and you have really talented people involved, you're able to put out content that's genuinely good rather than just, going for that easy, low-hanging fruit of tossing red meat at your own audience. And we do that from time to time, and we do it for fun from time to time. But it's not the primary goal. We want to make good content, not just ideologically driven, we're beating you over the head with our messaging kind of thing. I think it's part of the reason why comedy has suffered over the last several years, and it hasn't suffered across the board. There's great comedians doing really great work, but a lot of, especially like the late night comedy, which is unwatchable in my opinion for the most part, is because you've got so much. It's narrative driven. It's guarding the narrative rather than challenging the narrative so much of the time. And so I think the Bee, one of the advantages of the Bee is that we're willing to go there and make the jokes that you're not supposed to make. And I appreciate when I see other comedians doing that too. So maybe that's the key differentiator.
I think that's a really interesting distinction you just made between, look, we happen to be conservative, we have a perspective, but we are aiming for the funny. And I think we've seen it, we're seeing it actually more on both sides now, but I think conservatives in particular, like Jordan Peterson used to talk about why the left and the right need each other, right? Because conservatives have executive function and order, but the chaos, the left of center needs that sort of playful spirit, and they need that sort of chaotic idea to push the boundaries. And I've noticed it particularly with comedy, where when oftentimes conservative outlets try to do comedy, it's exactly that, where they're putting the ideology before the comedic horse. They're putting that cart of like, let's just call Hillary Clinton an idiot.
Yeah.
And I'm like, where's the joke? All you're doing is giving that sort of red meat to people who already agree with you, and you're not aiming at the ideal, which is funny. And now I'm starting to see it on the left too, where everything has become just sort of Jon Stewart-esque commentary disguised as comedy. But they'll put up a picture of George Bush, and it's just like
both. You'll find examples on the Bee where we throw out that red meat, and it's just, and sometimes we're just leaning into a narrative that's out there just for the fun of it. But yeah, generally I think that's the philosophy, and it piggybacks on something that one of my favorite authors and thinkers said. C.S. Lewis, and this is a slight paraphrase, but he said, we don't need more Christian books. He's talking from a Christian perspective. We don't need more Christian books. We need more good books written by Christians. And so that's kind of the philosophy that we're taking to the Babylon Bee.
It's interesting. So what do you think that does when you have your ideology that supersedes, that comes first, but you're aiming at the funny? Can you explain that a little bit more when you say good books written by Christians? To what extent does one's value set inform their art?
Well, yeah. I mean, if your values are latent in your work, then you're going to be focused on what's most important if you're doing something creative, which is entertaining people, telling a good story. You want this, like Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, for example, it's so widely loved and cherished as literature because it's a great story. a well-told story, a well-structured narrative with characters that have depth, and it's not just, you know, trying to beat you over the head with a message, but there is a message and there are values embedded in it. So I think if you lead off with quality and the story, and you try to make something that's actually genuinely good, if not great, you're going to have a much better reason. You're going to capture a much broader audience, and you're going to be able to reach them with the values that you want to promote in more of a roundabout way. It slips under the door instead of banging on it.
The Fountainhead is a great example of that, and Atlas Shrugged.
Yes.
I think, yeah.
Yeah, well, she always talks about the story and the novel coming first.
Right.
I think some of her stuff, you know, it's been a long time since I've read those books, but I do remember very long speeches from some of the main characters that are preachy.
Yeah, these people don't exist in real life. And Ayn Rand novels are like Henry Reardon looked at the steel and had an orgasm. It's like,
yeah, and they will go off on these very long speeches where they are getting deeply philosophical, and they're communicating ideas that she wants to communicate in a little bit of an unrealistic way. But they are still very engaging. I enjoy the books very much.
It's like, Howard, how you feeling? Well, I feel like the prominence of mankind must be the ideal Superman that must engage himself into the world, namely by philosophy alone and by productivity as his primary objective through reason. Oh!
Yeah, there's some sermons in there for sure.
It's sermons, and there's this sort of like her, you know, the ideal man animates almost all of her characters, or the ideal anti-man.
Yes.
And so they're like these idealistic representations of people. Mm-hmm. So relatability isn't the Ayn Rand strong suit. The power of the ideas and the philosophy is. And so she does, obviously, it's very thorough in how her novels are played out. But
she did that in a very creative way, though. Yeah. And her characters were so eloquent and thoughtful that it was that even though they were like these lengthy sermons, they were still fascinating. It was like she had embedded a bunch of essays in her novel, which was really interesting.
If you read that in your 20s, it might be different if you're reading that as like a 40-year-old, but in your 20s when you read that, it's very effective.
Yeah.
You're not quite as critical or cynical yet.
I was in my 20s, I think, when I read those books. It's been a little while.
Same. I did when I finished Atlas Shrugged. I remember my brain going
and
like rewiring. And then you watch C-SPAN and you're like, oh my God, this is prophecy. It's crazy.
Yeah.
And then you get into more other stories. There's never any children in the books, you know. It's like, all right, selflessness and all this stuff. But like, I mean, I get it. I like the philosophy, and I think politically it's very astute and pretty consistent on the Ayn Rand and the Ayn Rand front. But do you think there's something unique about the like sort of leftist, more liberal, left of center value set that when it comes to comedy, if it gets too ideologically driven, there is something about needing the audience to buy in and agree and conform, like this presumed common knowledge, whereas opposed to where comedy is supposed to kind of push or make you think or give you this sort of like sense of discomfort. You see this in the late night when everyone gets up there and goes, right?
Yeah.
Like presumed common knowledge. Like it's not even a joke. I'm not trying to push you. I'm not trying to get you to this edge. I'm not trying to make you uncomfortable with my thought process because my values require, like you said, if you already have worked out values that you hold, then it will be implied in your work. And you're trying to tell a great story. You're not trying to convert or preach, but you see it so much. Maybe it's just from my angle on the left and the left wing comedian sort of angle, which is making sure everyone buys in first to the values before we can laugh at anything.
Well, and someone called it, I don't know who coined the term, but someone called it clapter. It's not really the laughter of amusement, but it's the applause of agreement and affirmation that they're going for, which is it's a weird thing to target in comedy. Yeah. I think comedy, you go to see a comedian to laugh at other people and ideas, but also at yourself, and to be made uncomfortable to some extent, to be challenged in some ways, and to think of something in like a new and interesting way, rather than to just go there to hear somebody promoting whatever the popular narrative is.
And it bothers me the most when that clapter is called satire.
Yeah.
Like they misuse that word as if they're accomplishing something.
Right,
it bothers me to no end. And I mean, I think what you guys do is actual satire because you're willing to take down people from your own quote unquote side.
Yes,
you're willing to actually have a perspective, whether or not it agrees with everyone who's.
I think it's necessary to. I think we'd be derelict in our duty if we were hands off on targets that that we like politically, or that we agree with on most issues, or that we want to remain friends with, so we don't want to piss them off. Like you have to be willing to go there. And I've started, I've met a lot of prominent people. I've met a lot of politicians and famous people that we often make fun of. And I sometimes tell them, I'm like, we can be friends, but just understand that sometimes we're going to have to make fun of you. And I don't want to be getting a text later on saying, hey man, why'd you make that joke? It's like, well, you're a public figure and you're putting yourself out there. And if you say something or do something stupid, we're going to mock you. It's our job. And I think it's really important that anybody who's engaged in maybe satire more specifically than just comedy, because comedy isn't necessarily ideologically aligned on one side or the other. We are conservative satirists, and we do have an ideology that's coming through in the jokes that we make a lot of the time. But we should be willing to challenge. I think it's a very healthy thing, not just to laugh at ourselves, but to challenge our own ideas and to challenge our own figures, because we really shouldn't be putting our faith in people and institutions. There are ideas that we should be committed to. There's principles that we should be committed to, but every person is fallible. Everybody's on the ship of fools at one point or another. And so it's extremely important, I think, that we not hold anybody to a different standard where we just are hands off. And so that's healthy. It's healthy mentally, emotionally, spiritually, and it's also more entertaining. But we're not like, oh, we're 100% objective and we make fun of the right as equally as we make fun of the left. There's definitely imbalance there, because coming from a conservative Christian worldview as we do, we see a lot more absurdity and insanity on the left than we do on the right. The right isn't trying to tell you that men can get pregnant, that saying that 2 + 2 = 4 is racist. We don't have those kinds of absolute absurdities that people like Chesterton saw as coming down the road, like on the horizon. He said back in 1911, the world has become too absurd to be satirized.
Yeah, but the right is saying that if a man gets pregnant, he has to be forced to keep the child, Seth. So that's...
Oh, yeah. Very, very mockable.
Yes, it's sort of like where Bill Maher has been going. It's like, look, you know where I stand, but the crazy now has been shifting to the left. And that's where I'm targeting a lot of my stuff.
I see Bill Maher challenging the left a lot. And that is I don't think he's entirely intellectually honest. But he's willing to be at some point. There are certain lines where he's like, okay, this is too extreme. This is too far. This isn't right. And I'm going to hold my own side to account for that. I respect the hell out of him for that.
Where do you think he's not intellectually honest in particular?
I think he caricatures a lot of views and viewpoints. So his stance on religion, I think he's extremely harsh on religion. I don't think he's intellectually honest about the positives that have come out of Christianity, for example. He has very little positive to say about any religion, including a religion that I think has fostered a world in which he can be free to do the kind of comedy that he does.
Well,
so
it's interesting.
He's almost sitting in Christianity's lap. He's sitting in God's lap to slap him in the face, and I think that's problematic.
He also, as far as clapter goes, every joke Bill Maher makes in the monologue is like, "I'll wait," and he waits and pauses like, "No, that was a joke." Waits for the clap.
I'm sure he's got those big applause signs that he's got illuminating.
It's interesting observing where the cultural tides shift, where then when there's like a dominant thing in the culture, like say organized religion that was coming up in the 90s and early 2000s, then Bill Maher's come out, and the sort of new atheists that came out of that in the Hitchens and the Harris and the Dawkins, the religialists, was responding to that. But I feel like now, I wonder what Bill Maher would have to say about the woke religion that takes the place of those when you strip the soil from people from the foundations of Western civilization and its Judeo-Christian roots. You're left with people who will believe in anything. If they don't believe in something valuable, they'll find other very dark things to believe in. And it certainly has given a lot of pause to those people who wanted to just say, we can just be secular humanists and live without all of that has built our civilization. So I'd be curious to revisit that conversation, because I know he likes to make fun of the, evangelical right that just sort of are biblical literalists and whatever, and that's low-hanging fruit from that perspective.
Well, you see a lot of people. So there are atheists. There are people like, I think, I haven't seen the clip, but I saw something on X about how Elon was responding to Jordan Peterson and saying he thinks of himself as kind of like a cultural Christian. I'm not sure if those are his words. There's others who are saying
Dawkins
things
said
like
that too, yeah.
What's that?
Dawkins recently said that too, which I would have never heard. 20
Yeah,
years ago.
yeah. Dawkins has recently conceded that there is value to having these structures in place and having these these values. Dawkins, he takes away with one hand what he gives with the other. Dawkins talks about how we're all just dancing to the tune of our DNA, and there's no objective right and wrong. He's a very moral person who condemns a lot of behavior and views and ideologies himself. So he realizes the need to have that, while he's also preaching a message that undermines it. And so that's where I would say that's the same type of intellectual dishonesty when I'm talking about intellectual dishonesty with Bill Maher, that any of these anti-religion, anti-God atheists are landing in. But there are many others. James Lindsay is a good example of someone who is an atheist, but sees the value in the Christian ethic, and Western values are predicated upon a lot of that. And he understands that if you jettison that, if you get rid of that, then you do have problems. And so I think it's becoming much more widely realized as we've gone down this social experiment of embracing secular progressivism and how extreme it's become.
Yeah. I recently saw the clip of Dawkins being interviewed where he conceded. He's like, I'm a cultural Christian. I love Christmas carols. I love churches. I love it all. And I approached him at this Dissident Dialects conference just to try to kibitz with him a little bit. And I was waiting for him to make his remarks. I walked up, I said, Professor Dawkins, are we going to be opening with some Christmas carols from you today? And he went,
call me Dick.
His tone has changed though, right? I mean, he was so angry 20 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And extremely anti-Christianity. He wasn't soft on it with the cult. He was anti-Christianity in every sense. Mm-hmm. And I think he's backtracked on that a little bit. And that's a good thing. Whether he'll actually become a Christian is a very different thing. We'll see. But
Ian Hersey Alley style,
yeah.
But I just also wonder, in realizing, do you draw a link between sort of the woke mob religion that's taken over on campuses amongst young people when you strip away the foundational meanings and all the utility that comes with religion, community, values, things like that? When you strip that away, you start to see the consequences of pushing of what the new atheists and secular humanists pushed against for so many years. And I wonder if
you end up seeing, you see a lot of chaos and confusion. You see primarily reality denial. Mm-hmm. The willingness to go to the point where, and this is where it starts. I think this is part of what has prompted Dawkins to kind of shift his perspective a little bit, is that you start going down this path where there's actually this denial that there are sex differences, or that the sexes, the male and female sexes, aren't binary. And he's like, I'm a biologist. Yes, they are binary. And so he's like, we've got to stand firmly on the fact that there is actual truth and there is reality, and we want to describe reality accurately. We can't just throw that out the window too and make everything conform to whatever we feel or imagine to be the case. And so I think that young people, especially when you see what's going on college campuses and everything, they're adopting a new moral framework, this woke moral framework, that pits oppressor against oppressed, and the oppressors can do no right and the oppressed can do no wrong. And so you end up with college students on campus cheering for literal terrorists because they fall into the oppressed category, and for the oppressed, all things are permitted. And so, it's basically a moral argument that goes, for the oppressed, all things are permitted. Hamas is oppressed, therefore for Hamas all things are permitted. It's how do you end up in that? If you've gotten so far from what's sane and what's good and what's true, when you start reaching those kinds of conclusions. And I'm happy to link arms with atheists who see that.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think also for a long time from the Dawkins or New Atheist perspective, what they saw as the opponent or enemy of their rationality or science-based rationality was organized religion, but without realizing that we're talking about different magisteria here, and we're talking about mythological truth, and we're talking about spiritual truth, and then there's science, and they're not trying to necessarily encroach on that. And these days, what the woke ideology is trying to do is reinterpret actual scientific facts that we know, and that's now the very dominant enemy of rationality. So
I think it's interesting that the two different magisteria. There's truth to that. Science is trying to do a very different thing than religion is trying to do. But I think it was Alvin Plantinga who said there's deep compatibility between the scientific endeavor and like the Christian worldview, because the rational intelligibility of the universe, the fact that we're conscious and we're able to reason, we're able to seek truth. Like the things that we have to have faith in order to do science are grounded by a Christian worldview. There's deep compatibility there, and superficial incompatibility where you have, evolution explains how things came to be, and so therefore, we don't need God or something like that. He doesn't see that there's really, on a surface level, maybe you could see that, but then as you dig further into it, it's like, well, you even need God for evolution. So I think the deep incompatibility is between an atheistic naturalistic worldview and science itself. You lose all foundation for even doing science if you adopt an atheistic naturalistic worldview. And so they're in different domains. You can have either a significant amount of compatibility or a significant amount of incompatibility, depending on what the worldview is that's grounding whatever you're trying to do.
Yeah, and one is describing what the world is, and one is focused on what you ought to do in it, But I think that it prevents Dawkins from, not throwing the baby out with the bathwater when he takes a thing in a biblical verse and says, did this actually happen? Was there a virgin birth? Did the sea actually split the way it's described literally through a scientific lens, and then proceeds to throw the baby out with the bathwater?
Well, religion does also offer explanatory resources. You've got, if you try to explain how cars came into existence, or why a car works or how it exists, you can talk about the physics of the engine, everything. You can give a scientific explanation of the Ford car. Yeah. But in order to explain why it exists in the first place, you also need Henry Ford, who invented it. Right. And came up with the designs for it. And so the two they're different explanations. There's the agency explanation, the scientific explanation, but you need both of them. Right. And I guess what I would say is that the naturalistic, atheistic, secular progressives, they do away with half of the equation.
And they're both in a pursuit of a type of truth, and the truth is still held as the standard, whether you're coming at it from one perspective or another. I wanted to shift a little bit into what we were talking about in terms of the cultural divide of conservatives and liberals with regard to comedy, as we were just talking about it before. It used to be this sort of clear divide, like as you were saying, the crazy, wacky ideas on the left, we take, at the Babylon Bee, you take a perspective where those are where the majority of ideas are, and that's why we're going to mock them, and that's why once upon a time it was exclusively cancel culture. We're fighting against this cancel culture. They can't handle different ideas. But do you find that we find ourselves now at a moment where we're seeing the pendulum swing too far, especially in light of after October 7th, where a lot of conservatives and this rise of far right-wing anti-Semitism that's come up is confusing this idea of, well, we're against cancel culture, so let's play with the most provocative idea we can. Let's talk about Jews on Twitter. Let's start saying anti-Semitic stuff just to prove this point, or maybe we are hateful, but it's sort of like confusing the idea that any idea should be spoken about simply because we can, because we're against cancel culture. We're just going to say the worst things we can. And I've seen this manifest in a rise of far-right anti-Semitism that the left claimed existed during the Trump era, but I saw it maybe very, very small and marginal. But now I'm seeing it as this new sort of cultural, edgy place where a lot of anti-Semites are coming to play, and it's pretty concerning. What are your thoughts on that?
I don't know that the right is really 100% against cancel culture, for one thing. I mean, I see a lot of people trying to fight fire with fire and responding in kind to the left and doing it very openly and proudly, where they're saying, look, this is what they tried to do to us, so we're going to do it back. And if once we get power, we're going to punish and abuse them the way they punished and abused us. I see a lot of that from the right, and that does concern me, because I want no part in that. I think that when people are saying things that you don't believe or that you don't like or that you find offensive, the appropriate response to that is to refute it if you want to, ridicule it if you want to, ignore it if you want to. Like, we don't, one of the biggest things that's overlooked in this whole conversation about cancel culture and censorship is, the left abused the power that they had to try to stamp out voices that disagreed with them. The dissenting voices were suppressed. And so many people were fueling that by saying, oh, why this person's saying such provocative and hateful things, they can't be allowed to speak. And there are all these tools at our disposal. We forget that we have these tools at our disposal. We can choose who we want to listen to. And you don't have to actually take away somebody's voice. You can just simply tune out. You can mute them. You can block them, unfollow, you can control what kind of content you consume, and you don't have to listen to those people. I think taking away their speech is a worse crime than whatever it is they're saying that's offending you.
But what if you employ them?
What's that?
But what if you employ that person or have a licensing deal with them or something like that? In other words, the distinction between legal consequences for speech and any consequences. Well,
that's different. So, I've had to fire people in the past, and sometimes it's because of something that they've said or done, and I don't view that as a speech issue because, first of all, you do have a right of association, especially like, does a Christian church really have to hire an atheist to come in and preach? No, of course not. They can make the choice not to hire people with views that they don't want to see promoted. There is that freedom that businesses have to make hiring and firing decisions to some extent on the basis of ideology. You're not. What you're doing, if you fire somebody, you're not taking away their voice. Like, look at Daily Wire and Candace Owens, for example. Daily Wire parted ways with Candace Owens, but is she still allowed to speak in the public square? Of course. They're like, we're not going to pay you any longer to speak on this platform. Go speak on another platform if you want to. So I don't view that as a speech issue. The many people on the right were up in arms saying this is cancel culture, this is censorship. No, it's not. It's absolutely, there is a distinction to be made between a private employer who says, we're no longer on the same page with this person and don't want to employ this person. They have the freedom to employ whoever they want and let go of them for whatever reasons they want. And those people have the right then to go out and speak freely somewhere else. So as long as you're not taking away, the problem with what the left was doing is they were taking away people's voices in the public square. They were trying to silence your ability to speak at all because they didn't like what you were saying. And that is radically different. And I don't want to see the right make the same mistake. But I do also see a problem on the right where you mentioned, the anti-Semitism and the hatred and all of that. It is rising in volume and it is becoming more pervasive on the right. And to some extent, it feels like it's a reaction to, and some of them will actually talk about this, white men in particular were so vilified for so long. I think there are a lot of young white men who feel like, who are feeling very angry and very upset and very marginalized themselves. And so they want to assert themselves in a way where they're saying, you can't ignore me, you can't hold me down. I'm going to, in fact, take control and be the supremacist asshole that you caricatured me as. And it's like they're trying to become originally, I think when Trump was running for president, Trump was smeared as Hitler and his followers were smeared as Nazis. And that wasn't generally true. But now it feels like the right is actually in reaction to a lot of those caricatures. There are people on the right who are becoming that caricature. I see that happening. And that's very concerning too.
Jordan Peterson predicted this to a T like 5-6 years ago. He was talking about, he was on stage saying, he was having a debate with Michelle Fields and Dyson, one of the Monk debates. And he was saying that if you keep playing this game, he's like, we don't know when the right can go too far, but we don't know when the left can go too far. It's like, well, if you keep playing this woke identity politics and putting identity as paramount, you're going to have the white identitarians react to this. And that's what you're going to see. You're going to see a rise in the white identitarian right who's going to say, hey, you're telling me I'm nothing but a white man and that's my primary characteristic that defines me? Okay, let's let it define me and I will play this game.
And they'll literally stand and say, you know what? I am better than everyone else. And now watch this. And that seems to be the attitude that you see, which is it's a white supremacist attitude that didn't exist until the character. It was like the left manifested it. They brought it into existence.
Right.
And that's deeply concerned. It's very troubling to see that there aren't enough leaders on the right. I don't think there are enough leaders on the right who are vocally condemning that. They all want to downplay it and act like it's this fringe thing and it's not a threat. I see it bleeding into the mainstream. I do see it as a real problem for the right, and I wish there were more who are being vocal about it.
And what do you make of this tension in the marriage of Judeo-Christian that some people are exploiting? This wedge they're trying to drive through, that for so long there's been this amazing marriage truce, whatever you want to call it, of Judeo and Christian values that have sort of made Western civilization, and we acknowledge that. And between the Christian community and the Jewish community, it's been this wonderful time. And I feel like now politically you're seeing, especially on the far right, this opportunity of certain people to drive this wedge between these two factions, which has been
what concerns me the most is the exploitation of Christianity to that end too, where you now have the Christian anti-Semites. They proclaim that Christ is king. That's their phrase that you'll find it in Nick Fuentes' bio and all of the Groyper army that follows him. They'll claim that Christ is king while at the same time praising Hitler and declaring their hatred for the Jews. And there just couldn't be anything more un-Christian than that attitude. And so it really bothers me as a Christian personally to see Christians adopting this attitude of vitriol and hatred towards, well, for one thing, Jesus was Jewish. The New Testament is written by Jews, with the exception of Luke. It's wild to me to see that kind of rhetoric and that kind of attitude, that heart, which is not loving, it's not forgiving, it's not full of grace, it's not full of charity, it's full of animosity and anger and vitriol, and it's a disease. And I don't think that it's representative of Christianity at all. This is a hijacking of Christianity in order to perpetuate anti-Semitism. And that is yet another thing that I think people, prominent leaders on the right, have been too hesitant to confront and in denial about whether it's really a significant thing. So I try to be vocal about this stuff. I don't see a ton of other people really taking much of a stand, which is interesting. I'm not sure what they're afraid of.
What if someone responded where they were saying, it has nothing to do with Jews. I'm just acknowledging and accepting my own faith, my own identity, and trying to express that publicly. Like where how can you be so sure that the Christ is King thing is so tied up in anti-Semitism?
The phrase,
yeah.
Well, so it's the way that people are using the phrase. Like I have people comment on my posts sometimes, Christ is King, you dirty Jew.
Okay.
Well, that's a
pretty
giveaway.
clear.
That's a giveaway.
Not all of them finish it with that phrase, with the you dirty Jew part.
They're just kidding.
They some of them will just say Christ is King, but they mean that. They're just not. Okay. It's like you can say there are contexts in which saying Christ is King is a perfectly appropriate thing to say as a Christian. And let me read something straight out of the Bible here. This is the start of Romans 9.
We'll just bleep this
out. It's headed Paul's anguish over Israel. He's literally going to declare Christ as King, but listen to the context in which he does it. Okay. He says, I speak the truth in Christ. I'm not lying. My conscience confirms it through the Holy Spirit. I have great sorrow and unceasing anguish in my heart. For I could wish that I myself were cursed and cut off from Christ for the sake of my people, those of my own race, the people of Israel. Theirs is the adoption to sonship. Theirs the divine glory, the covenants, the receiving of the law, the temple worship, and the promises. Theirs are the patriarchs, and from them is traced the human ancestry of the Messiah, who is God over all, forever praised. Amen.
Well, we lost me there.
So he's saying Christ is King, but what context is he saying it in? In a context of expressing anguish over his own people, the Jewish people, who have rejected Jesus, the Messiah, in his view. So that is a very different expression of Christ as King than what you see coming out of the anti-Semitic right now. When they say Christ is King, they are saying it to remind Jews that they rejected Christ and they deserve, as Christ killers, to burn in hell. That's what they mean when they say Christ is King. That is 100% the opposite of what Paul is saying when he is expressing it in the start of Romans.
I want to go deeper here, and I think it's interesting if you're comfortable. Your background is kind of an interesting one too. If you're comfortable talking about, like, that you have family, you've told me that are Jewish, you have Jewish ancestry, and were raised Christian, so you kind of have this unique blend of affinity and even family roots, right, between Jewish.
Yes.
And
so the anti-Semitic right would say I'm a snake in the grass. I am an evil Jew who's pretending to be a Christian. Right,
nice.
So that I can infiltrate.
You're doing great work, Sethi. You're doing great work.
So I can infiltrate.
Thank you.
I converted inauthentically to infiltrate. Yeah, my mom. So on my mother's side, I have Ashkenazi heritage.
Mm-hmm.
So, but she wasn't raised in like an Orthodox or practicing Jewish home. She became a Christian very early on in her youth. Led my dad to Christianity, and he then became a Christian pastor. Mm-hmm. And so I grew up in the church, the Christian church, Protestant Christianity, but with that Jewish ethnic heritage. So I'm one of those people who's ethnically Jewish, but obviously, believes that Jesus Christ is my Lord and Savior, which many Jews do profess, not the majority of them, but there are many Jews who believe that Jesus was the Messiah. I'm not one of those, like, I was a Jew and I became a Christian. I've always been a Christian. I just have that ethnic heritage on that. Uh-huh. So I am an interesting hybrid of the two. Jewish by Jewish law and custom. As I'm sure from your mother's side, that's what you are. I'm known as, according to Jewish people, I am Jewish.
You're Jewish, Seth. I got to break it to you.
Yeah, no. So, but by faith, I'm a Christian. Right. So, yeah, it is an interesting dynamic at play.
Right. Do you feel personally threatened when you see anti-Semitism? Is there something sort of like in your psyche that feels part of that attack is on you as well?
Well,
even though it's not your faith.
Yeah. So I think there are lots of people out there with hatred for various races and religions, and I don't treat speech as violence, and so I don't feel like, I'm being attacked by the people that hate me. It doesn't. I don't feel threatened by it in that way, where I'm going to treat those words as violence. That's kind of how the left acts. But yeah, I mean, personally, what's frustrating to me is more so than that is it's my Christian identity. To quote Paul again, Paul, in the Christian worldview, there is neither Jew nor Gentile. We're all one in Christ. If you believe it, whether you're a Jew who believes in Jesus or you're a Gentile who believes in Jesus, you're all the same. Your identity is in Christ, right? That's what Paul says. And so it's bizarre to me to hear people who claim to be Christians suggesting that I'm not really a part of Christianity and that I'm a faker or a liar or a deceiver because I have this Jewish ethnic heritage. It's like you don't even understand what Christianity teaches if you're suggesting things like that.
I have a question about that on the theological history. At what point did you have this Paul perspective on his affinity and sympathy and solidarity with Jews of what he wants for his.
Well, he was a Jew, so yeah.
Yeah. But at what point did that attitude, where was that split in that? Because you do see these traces from the early days of Christian anti-Semitism as Jews being the rejectors, Jews being demonic, Jews being the rebels, the children of Satan, or whatever you want to throw at them. Like, where did that start to happen and where did it come from, and to what extent now is Christianity has rid itself of that? Because you speak about Christians, that is not Christian. That's not what Christians are. But I guess for me, who's foreign to it, within Judaism, you have various denominations and various cultures from different parts of the world. But I've heard Christians talk about, well, he's not what I am. They're Catholic, or they're it's almost looked at as different religions. Someone who's Protestant converts to Catholicism. You hear it spoken in those terms. So can you shed light on the various sources of attitudes towards the attitudes for or against anti-Semitism as rooted in early Christian theology, where that came from, and then how it manifests today?
Well, I think it's been there probably since the beginning. It has very early roots. Chrysostom was writing in, I don't know, the 3rd or 4th century. I'm not a historian, so don't hold me to
Jamie?
that.
Jamie, pull it up. Sorry, we don't have a Jamie.
Maybe the fourth or fifth century. He had extremely anti-Semitic writings that were later influenced other very prominent and influential Christian thinkers like Martin Luther. Mm-hmm. And his writings were even cited by Hitler in some of their propaganda against the Jews.
I mean, if Paul is so revered, how does it go from that attitude towards Martin Luther? Where does that come from?
Well, I mean, there are certain, and they do this today too. There are certain texts that they will cherry pick and they will try to suggest that this is talking about the Jews as a people, as a whole, rather than just the spirit of the individuals that are being talked about there. They will cherry pick verses from the Bible to try to support this view. And they will cite the fact, and it is a fact, that, the religious leaders were rejecting Jesus as a blasphemer and calling for him to be crucified. And, the Romans went along with that to put down the uprising that they saw potentially coming. And so there is historical fact that they will cite, and there are verses that they will cherry pick. And so if you have animosity towards the Jews for whatever reason, you can find a reason, you can try to find a justification for it in those things. And once it became embedded in some of these prominent Christian thinkers, who carried weight. And Luther, by the way, didn't always have those views. Luther was very sympathetic to the Jews and wanted to see them come to faith in Christ early on. And then years later in his writings, he wrote, I think it was called The Jews and Their Lies or something like that. He started writing very anti-Semitic stuff. So, I mean,
for InfoWars, he was writing. No, I'm just kidding.
You can find justification for it if you really look for it, and that's what you want to see. But but when you actually zoom out from that and take those verses in context, and you actually listen to what Paul is saying, it is no part of Christianity to hate the Jews for putting Christ in, especially Jews today. Look at the mentality that you have to get into in order to hate Jews today for being Christ killers. What responsibility does a Jewish man today have for killing Jesus? Mm-hmm. It's like trying to blame a white man today, which they object to. These guys on the right that will do all this, they'll object very strongly if you try to hold them accountable for slavery, won't they?
Right.
Why should they be held accountable for slavery? So,
and also to externalize the Jews as this other entity in the context where everyone is Jewish or Roman. And there are political dissensions going on at the time. So it doesn't make any sense. In the theology and the story, Judas betrays Jesus. Judas was Jewish. Jesus was Jewish. Everyone's Jewish.
Everyone's Jewish. The early church was Jewish. The New Testament is Jewish. Jesus' identity was as the Jewish Messiah who was fulfilling prophecies from the Old Testament, the Jewish,
so do you think
Jewish
it's
documents. So this is he was a rabbi. He was a Jewish teacher. And so, but with the early church starting as Jews who believed that Jesus was who he claimed to be, they were at odds with the other Jews who disagreed with him. And so it was Jews versus Jews until
this was family infighting.
But this is the really interesting thing. When someone who's not a Jew becomes a Christian, what Paul teaches is that they are being, the words he uses are grafted in. They're being grafted into the true faith, which is the Jewish faith. He never stopped being a Jew. He never stopped believing what he believed. He just believed that Jesus was the Messiah, while others rejected that Jesus was the Messiah. So it's a continuation of his Jewish faith, where he's now latched on to Jesus as the person that he places his hope and trust in. But when other people are adopting that, when they become believers in Jesus, Paul says they are becoming heirs of Abraham by faith. And so they are joining into the Jewish religion. They're not out there in their own separate religion. Now, obviously, because there are so many Jews who don't believe in Jesus, it's like we're in different religions. Mm-hmm. But the Christian theology and Paul's theology is that non-Jews who become believers in Christ are being grafted into the Jewish religion.
Just tell me honestly, at the end of this podcast, are you going to try to baptize us? I'm just wondering.
You're making a pretty good case. I don't know.
But that attitude, I feel like I feel like it certainly was lost in the early days of Christianity, and there was a departure. Maybe as Christianity became more universal and people forgot the roots of it.
Let me just say something about what you just said. If what I believe, based on my beliefs as a Christian, I believe that Jesus was who he claimed to be. My attitude towards someone, like if you don't believe that Jesus is the Messiah, right?
Yeah.
Then my the posture that I adopt to you should be one of, okay, well, let's have a conversation about that. Maybe I want to try to convince you of that so that you will also become a believer. Now, you may be resistant to that. Maybe you don't want to have that conversation. But that's the Christian heart. That's why there's always been, you talked about that, that friendly relationship between Jews and Christians, because Christianity properly understood has a heart of love and concern for Jews who reject Jesus. And while it may be offensive to you that Christians want you to believe what they believe, but they're out of concern and love, like what Paul was saying in Romans 9 that I was reading earlier, out of concern and love, they just want to see Jews become saved too. That's the Christian attitude towards Jews. When you see people on the right proclaiming Christ as king while disparaging Jews and calling them Christ killers and deceivers who deserve to burn in hell, that is not Christianity. Mm-hmm. So Christian anti-Semitism is an oxymoron.
So Christian, we kind of think it's this platonic love, but we keep Christians in the friend zone, and I think maybe some people are a little upset about that. It's like, hey, like we love Israel, thank you. We love the Jews, thank you. Come to Jesus. Well,
now, I mean, what would you rather have? Would you rather have a Christian who's like, hey, I think you should believe in Jesus, and I wish that you did. Would you rather hear that from them, or would you rather hear, hey, you're a Christ killer, and I think you deserve to burn in hell?
Oh, death's the former. Definitely the former. There's no question about it. And also, it's theology. So at the end of the day, like, as long as we live in a society that can respect and tolerate religious differences, that doesn't impose, then it's just a nice, fruitful,
right.
I never see
conversation. You won't see many genuine Christians trying to impose their Christianity on Jewish people.
Yeah.
How big of a problem is the Christian anti-Semitism? Because I've seen it. I don't know. I maybe I'm not as aware of it as you guys are. But do you think it's this like real growing concern that the right has to contend with?
Yes. Yeah. And
it's
not
ascending.
because
It's ascending. I'm saying at this thing.
Not because we haven't sufficiently censored them. I was actually in favor of Nick Fuentes coming back onto X because I believe that as long as his speech is lawful, he should be allowed to talk in the public square. And if I hate what he's saying, I don't have to listen to him. And if he says something I think is wrong, I can try to, correct him. It's not because they haven't been censored enough. I think it's just because it hasn't been dealt with. It hasn't been taken seriously. I think a lot of people are turning a blind eye to it for whatever reason.
But what do you think motivates somebody like a Fuentes? It doesn't seem to be a pure religious motivation. There's clearly this sort of disgruntled resentment complex going on, or feeling displaced. And then the medicine that is religion, that provides a certain supremacy to his identity, is what's being used to fuel a community of people. And it's a weird like cherry pickup. Let's take the Christian white identity, white nationalism, and use it to make myself.
I mean, think of how appealing you can in a country where Christianity is very popular and is seen as and is viewed as a sound moral ethical system, that has good things to teach and contributes positively to our culture and society. If you wrap yourself in the language and symbols of Christianity, you can amass a lot more power and influence than maybe you would otherwise. I think there is an incentive to do that. It's very clear for the reasons I've already given that I think people are co-opting these phrases, co-opting these symbols, the symbol of the cross, the name of Jesus, to advance a very hateful anti-Christian ideology. And they're doing that for the reason of it's highly effective. It really masks who they are. It makes them seem like they are more mainstream than they are, because Christianity, besides secular progressivism, which all the cultural and institutional power promotes, what's second to that in terms of cultural influence and popularity? Well, Christian attitudes and values and people who identify as Christians. So, I think it's a ploy. It's a great ploy, and they are in fact the deceivers. It's projection when they call the Jews the deceivers.
And what about within these sort of like elements of Are there elements, maybe you know more about it than I do, as far as like within Catholicism in particular, like there's the sort of mainline acceptance of of the papacy and the Pope and the declarations of where the stances are currently as far as the Catholic Church's relationship to Jews or any other particular issues in the Jewish community or outside of it. But every once in a while you hear about certain people that are in these sort of defected or different areas or more extremist views of the Catholic Church. I remember when Mel Gibson was making The Passion, he talked about how, it was kind of unclear to me, like what areas, like rejecting certain things that the Pope was doing, especially with regard to tolerance and coexistence with other religions. Like there's these other elements that I don't know much about, but they seem a little darker. Do you know anything about that?
I've never been in the Catholic Church. I don't have a lot of familiarity with it from the inside.
Of the
but
doctrines?
I do see that a lot of this Christian anti-Semitism, I want to put it in quotes because it is an oxymoron, is coming from people who identify as Catholic. And I don't really know what the explanation is for that. I do think that some people join the Catholic Church without really understanding what Christianity is because they want to be a part of a structured religious system. It's very clear that they haven't fully taken on board what Christianity teaches if they're adopting that, if they're carrying with them that negative attitude towards the Jewish people when they do it. I don't know exactly why it's Catholicism that has this deep-seated problem of anti-Semitism. I'd have to look into that more to better understand that. But I do see some examples of people. I think Russell Brand has a very positive outlook, and he likes to share a lot about where he's going with his faith as he's become a Christian and as he's starting to develop in his understanding of the theology and the practical living, trying to live out his faith. His attitude seems very healthy and positive. So it's not like it's universally, everyone is adopting these kinds of attitudes. There seem to be exceptions.
Interesting.
I don't know. Has Russell Brand ever said anything anti-Semitic? I'm not sure if he has.
No, I don't think. I mean, I don't know what he's saying about Israel and Palestine. He used to certainly be more on the sort of like mainstream, like left-wing views towards the Middle East. He haven't seen.
He was married to Katy Perry.
Yeah.
Whose I think father has been accused of like, again, I don't know the specific, but I think he was some kind of leader in like a very intense Catholic church who was like accused of saying some stuff. I can't back that up with anything, but I do remember.
Is Russell Brand Catholic or Christian, or did he convert to Christianity or Catholicism in particular?
I think he converted to Catholic Christianity. So interesting. He's in the Catholic Church. That's my understanding.
We'll get him on the show. We'll have a little chat.
I literally thought that was a stunt he was doing for YouTube. I didn't realize he was.
I think he seems very genuine, and he really seems to understand. He really seems to understand what he's talking about. And he's reading a lot of great books. I mentioned C.S. Lewis earlier. He's reading C.S. Lewis. He's an interesting guy. The reason Russell Brand is so interesting to me is because he's now merged this, he was hyper mystical and spiritual but not like religious. And he's now merged that with religion, but he's also like very intellectual. He likes to think about things and why they are the way they are. He's very philosophical. And so he's like this mystical, spiritual, intellectual person. And you usually see, they're usually opposites. They're usually like hyper intellectual people who are not, spiritual and mystical. And then there's the people who are spiritual and mystical and reading the stars and the tea leaves and all that stuff, but they're not intellectual at all. And he's a weird hybrid of the two, which makes him an extremely fascinating character.
I'm sorry. You can trace the seed of sort of his, being curious about the spirituality all throughout for years and years, and in long conversations he had with Jordan Peterson on his podcast as he became more and more into that path.
And there's no one more articulate than him. He's incredible.
He is. He's great.
Seriously, he's amazing.
Just before we run out of time, I just want to be conscious of your time. Any final thoughts on just fun politics stuff of the day? Because it seems like it's been so crazy. It feels stranger than fiction, and it has for a while. Really, since Trump won in 2016, I feel like the world has been stranger than fiction. And you've seen a lot of your headlines when you cover things come true in the weirdest of ways at the B. But what do you think is going on here? What's happening? What is happening? Biden on a Sunday resigns. Everything conspiratorial just sounds that much more believable in today's day and age because the weirdest things keep coming true. What's your take?
Well, the conspiracy theorists have been validated time and time again. And on the one hand, it's like, it's wildly entertaining. It's extremely disconcerting. I do feel like there's a danger in it because you see a lot of people, errors errors always come in pairs, and you can have one. You can have the error of being extremely credulous and believing everything the scientists tell you and what the government tells you, whatever, and then and that makes you extremely gullible. That's one error, and then people can fall into the other error of being extremely skeptical, irrationally skeptical, as a response to that. As a way of rejecting all of that. It's like, well. And then they start rejecting all of science and everything that the government says, and you can't trust anything. And there's probably a middle path there somewhere. But it does seem like, there must be a middle path, because both of those are extreme opposite errors. But there is crazy stuff happening. You couldn't script this if you wanted to. If you did try to make this into a movie, people would be like, nah, that's not really believable. This is all too weird and insane. What's going on with Biden right now, not making any public appearances, and everyone's literally wondering, like, searches for "is Biden alive" are going through the roof on Google.
I told you this was going to happen, Seth. I told you. Alex Jones has been looking more and more credible every single day. Literally.
Now, I don't believe the Democrats are crazy. I don't put a lot of things past them. I don't believe they would be covering up Biden's death. The political price they would pay for covering something that monumental up would be too much. So I don't believe they would ever do that. But I do believe that if he's having severe medical or health complications right now, they're trying to keep him out of the public eye. And that makes sense. And so I definitely think that there's some validity to the conspiracies that, like, he's ill, he's had a stroke, maybe there's something that happened, if they could put it to rest, and they should put it to rest, and they aren't. So why aren't they?
Meaning he could have suffered some sort of episode where they're like, oh my God, this would just look so bad because it would affirm everything everybody's been saying. So we're going to just wait till it dies down. We're going to get people on Kamala or on the idea of an alternative. And then we're going to come out and say that, unfortunately, whatever. Not death, but maybe some.
When it comes to, like, the assassination attempt on Trump, I don't immediately rush to the conspiracy answer to that. I do tend to, what is it? Is it Hanlon's razor that everyone keeps citing?
Occam's razor?
What is
Occam's
it?
razor? Occam's razor is the one.
Occam's razor is the simplest explanation, is probably the best.
Yeah.
You don't need, you don't want unnecessary hypotheses layered onto things. But
the other
Hanlon's, or whatever it is that people keep citing, is that, it's, you don't attribute to malice what could be attributed to incompetence.
Right. Yeah. Tim Ferriss says that a lot.
Yeah. And I mean, there's certainly we have to keep that in mind, because I do think that there is a tremendous amount of incompetence when you look at, like, the DEI stuff that was happening in the agents that were there and the way that they were operating. It was clearly poorly managed. And whether it's like, are we using DEI to try to make Trump vulnerable? No, but the result of using DEI made him vulnerable, and the result of some of those decisions did. And so
many of these tiny women, they couldn't get out of it. They're so fat, they're so small, they're so slow.
Incompetence can definitely explain a lot of what happened there, but it is extreme incompetence, which makes it, you just wonder, what else could possibly be at play. But I don't know.
That's the thing. You have people saying he's on the roof. Hey, he's on. It's not like the shots came out of nowhere. There's footage of it that we can see, and we live at a time where mainstream media will with such a confidence tell you something that you saw that contradicts that. They will say things these days and cover things in a way that says no. I saw this.
It's harder to get into a movie theater without a ticket than it is apparently to get onto the roof with a gun to get a shot off at Trump. I mean, it's just
But yes, I think it tends to lean. It's sort of Michael Shermer. I'm a fan of Michael Shermer, who likes to debunk all. Are you familiar with him?
Yeah.
He has Skeptic Society. Like, basically, he's like, look, at the end of the day, like, the simplest explanation. Yeah, the fact that this probably was just a lone shooter who was crazy is probably the most likely explanation. But using him as a patsy, or that there are people that are incentivized to kill Trump before he gets to office, does seem not crazy. It seems something reasonable to assume that there are people who do not want Trump to come back. And even whether you call it deep state or like in different factions within the government, that being Trump is disruptive and doesn't necessarily play along, maybe there's and given the sequence of trying to take him down in every single way, from impeachment to this legal stuff, which we all saw was kind of nonsense. last resort, and it's like the Alex Jones thing. They're going to kill him, and they're going to try to kill him again. I'm telling you. They're going to give him the gay frog, and he's going to kill himself. No, I don't know.
Well, the rhetoric, when you listen to their rhetoric, they want you to believe that Trump is Hitler. They want you to believe that he's the greatest threat to democracy that this nation has ever seen. Mm-hmm. And then when someone tries to take him out, they're like, "Oh, our sympathy is with the Trump family. We so regret that this happened. There's no place for political violence." Like, wait a minute. Do you believe he's Hitler or don't you? Because if you believe he is that evil and that he's the greatest threat to democracy that we've ever seen, then you should want him taken out. It would be a good thing if he was taken out. It would save lives if he was taken out. The fact that you're mourning that someone tried to take him out, or that you're sympathetic to him and you're wishing him a speedy recovery, indicates that either you're lying in your sympathy or you were lying in your caricature of him. Mm-hmm. It's one of the two. You can't sincerely express both of those things.
And I thought, I mean, in this very moment, the hypocrisy of that statement, it's very, very resonant and true. But political rhetoric goes both ways. Conservatives for years would talk about Obama as the threat to our civil. I mean, we do that on both sides when we use tribal language and rhetoric, the language of sports as applied to politics. We need to crush them. We need to kill them. What happened in 2020 was they're stealing our democracy. So I always kind of like try to check myself on that confirmation bias. It's like we all kind of do it, but when it finally manifests and goes as far as violence, we start to say, okay, maybe that rhetoric was too much. So
yeah.
Do you think both sides are equally
You're right
guilty?
about that. I don't think it goes to the extent, though. I don't think, because you have not just the media personality. Well, you have the politicians like Biden and Kamala and whoever, and then you have the media also trumpeting these things. You don't have the right to left stuff doesn't get amplified or repeated in the same way that the left to right stuff does.
Well, because it's not affirmed by the mainstream.
It's not affirmed by that machine in the same way, and so it doesn't have the same kind. It doesn't carry the same kind of weight. I also don't think it goes quite as extreme, the rhetoric from the right. Obviously, there are some people who, talked about Obama that way, but but I don't think it went to the extent that I don't think anyone's ever talked about a political figure the way they've talked about Trump.
Right. Do you have any predictions? Who are they going to run? Is it going to be Kamala? What do we think?
It looks like they're all in on Kamala. It looks like they're all in, which is really interesting. I mean, she's done so much to secure our border, so,
Well, I have been to the border, and I will be at the border, and we have been to the border. That's going to be fun. Really, all in on Kamala. Yeah, everyone's like Michelle Obama. That just seems like, it's not going to do it. It seems like too out there.
No, he's not the right pick.
It's Kamala.
He said he's not the right pick for Michelle Obama. Hope and change, baby. I'm back. Seth Dillon, thank you so much for joining us here at Ami's House. Great schmoozing with you.
Yeah, I enjoyed it.
Truly.
Yeah, we appreciate it, and thanks so much. And
thanks for sharing the good word.
Yeah.
We're going to go get baptized. Ladies and gentlemen, that is Seth Dillon of the Babylon Bee. Exciting times, crazy times, weird times in all media, conservative media. Left-wing media is always crazy. Conservative media is going through an interesting phase. So it's nice to talk about it with you, Seth. Appreciate your time.
Enjoyed it. Thanks, guys.